The pen hit the glass table with a clean, final sound. Evelyn Carter did not look up immediately. She let the silence stretch, the way a blade lets a wound breathe before the blood follows. Then she lifted her eyes, and the entire boardroom seemed to contract around her gaze. Glass walls, 42nd floor, a city below them that had never once cared whether she lived or drowned. She had drowned before, quietly, alone. That was 6 months ago. Now she sat at the head of a table that could seat 20, flanked by executives in tailored suits who had once refused to return her emails. The document in front of her bore the Park Dominion Group letterhead, gold embossed, unambiguous, and her signature was the only one that mattered on this particular page. Across the table, a man shifted in his seat. His name was Daniel Brooks. He was 34, sharp-jawed, and wearing a tie that cost more than Evelyn's first gallery showing had grossed. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to rebuild anything, because he had never allowed himself to fall apart. He sat with his arms loosely crossed, the practiced ease of a man who expected rooms to tilt in his favor. The room was not tilting. Evelyn slid the document across the polished surface. "Funding is denied," she said. "The projections don't hold. We're not interested." Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly. The way expensive things crack, not dramatically, but in ways that cannot be undone. "Evelyn." "Mrs. Park." The correction came low, without heat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. At the far end of the table, almost perfectly still, sat a man who had not spoken once during the meeting. He had not needed to. His presence did the work, the kind of gravity that doesn't announce itself, it simply exists, and everything else arranges itself accordingly. Ji-hoon Park, chairman of Park Dominion Group, 41 years old, third wealthiest private individual in South Korea. The kind of man that financial journalists described as formidable because no single word was sufficient. He was watching his wife. Not protectively, not possessively, with something rarer, something that had taken 5 months of proximity to a woman who refused to be managed before it had appeared on his face. Respect. Evelyn pushed back her chair and stood. The room stood with her, not because protocol demanded it, but because the air did. Meeting adjourned. Daniel's hand pressed flat against the table. "You're making a mistake. This deal was always going to fail," she said simply. "You knew it when you walked in. You were hoping the name on the building would override the numbers." She paused. "It doesn't." She turned toward the door. Behind her, she heard Ji-hoon fall into step a half-beat later, not chasing, not leading, beside her. In the elevator, with the mirrored doors sliding shut, he spoke for the first time since the meeting had opened. "You enjoyed that." She considered denying it. A little. It showed. She glanced at him. "Is that a problem?" He looked straight ahead. The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but related to one. "It showed in a boardroom full of executives who now believe my wife is not someone to be tested." He paused. "No, it is not a problem." The elevator descended. She looked at her own reflection, the fitted blazer, the composed expression, the unfamiliar ease in her own posture, and thought about the woman who had sat on her bathroom floor 6 months ago with her hands pressed to her mouth so she wouldn't make a sound. That woman had believed one sentence. One sentence, spoken by the man now sitting somewhere above them on the 42nd floor, gathering his rejected documents and recalibrating his ego. "You'll never find anyone better than me." And here now, in the quiet fall of a glass elevator, Evelyn Carter, no, Evelyn Park, found that she could not locate a single part of herself that still believed him. 6 months earlier. If you've ever watched something you built with your bare hands begin to come apart, you know the particular texture of that silence. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives slowly in small indignities, a vendor who stops returning calls, a landlord who starts returning them too quickly, a bank statement that you flip face down on your desk and leave there. Evelyn Carter had been flipping statements face down for 3 months by the time Daniel left. She ran a mid-sized art consultancy called Trove, 7 employees, a gallery space in the meatpacking district, and a reputation that had been, until 18 months prior, quietly excellent. She sourced contemporary art for private collectors, curated installation projects for corporate lobbies, negotiated acquisitions that straddled the line between culture and investment. She was good at it because she understood people, what they wanted to appear to value, and what they secretly did. But a boutique business in an industry built on discretionary spending had a very thin margin for error. And the last 18 months had been nothing but error. A major client who pulled out after a scandal that had nothing to do with Evelyn, a gallery lease that renewed at double the rate, and a small mountain of medical debt accumulating in her father's name at a rehabilitation center in Queens. Her father, Raymond Carter, had suffered a stroke at 62. He was improving, slowly. The bills were not. And then, on a Wednesday night in March, Daniel Brooks sat across from her at a restaurant she hadn't been able to afford and told her he was leaving. "It's not about the business," he said, which was what people said when it was entirely about the business. "I just think we've grown in different directions." She had stared at him. They had been together for 2 years. "Vivian Chen reached out to me a few months ago," he continued. "Her family's tech fund is expanding. There's a real opportunity there." "Vivian Chen." She said the name carefully, the way you say something you're trying to make real. "She and I have a lot in common professionally." "Daniel," her voice was very even, "are you breaking up with me to date a tech heiress?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable. But discomfort, she was learning, was not the same as shame. He straightened his jacket. He cleared his throat. And then he said it casually, almost as an afterthought, the way people say the cruelest things. "Evelyn, be honest with yourself. What exactly do you have to offer someone right now? Your business is failing. You're drowning in your father's bills. You've been running on borrowed time for a year." He looked at her across the white tablecloth. "You'll never find anyone better than me. Not while you're like this. Maybe not ever." She did not throw her water glass at him. She thought about it. She chose instead to say nothing, to sit very still while the words settled into her chest like something wet and heavy. And then she signed the bill with a card she knew would clear only by miracle, and she walked out of the restaurant into the cold March air, and she kept her spine straight until she turned the corner. Then she sat down on a set of steps that smelled like rain and put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry. She just sat there with that sentence pressed against the inside of her ribs like a bruise. "You'll never find anyone better than me." She threw herself into work the way people throw themselves into cold water, because the shock of it leaves no room for anything else. She restructured her client outreach. She cut 2 positions she couldn't afford to keep and absorbed the workload herself. She renegotiated the gallery lease with a calm that surprised even the landlord, buying herself 4 more months. She stopped going to restaurants, stopped buying clothes, stopped doing anything that wasn't directly related to keeping Trove breathing. It was working, barely, in the way that burying both hands in a wound and pressing hard is technically working. And then, on a Tuesday in April, a man walked into the gallery. Evelyn was alone that afternoon. Her remaining staff were out on a site installation. The space was mid-transition, half a new collection hung, a ladder leaning against the far wall. She was on her knees on the floor, reviewing a shipping manifest, when the door opened. She heard the footsteps before she saw him, deliberate, unhurried, the kind of walk that belongs to people who have never been in a situation they didn't choose to enter. She looked up. He was tall not conspicuously, but enough. Dark coat, no tie. He wasn't dressed to impress. He was dressed the way people dress when impressing others has stopped being a concept they engage with. He was looking at the half-hung paintings with an expression that was not casual appreciation. It was assessment. His eyes moved across the work, the way a structural engineer moves across a building, looking for load points. "We're mid-installation," Evelyn said, rising from the floor, the manifest in her hand. "Public opening is Thursday." "I'm aware." He turned from the painting to look at her, direct, unblinking. "I wanted to see it before the opening." "The gallery, isn't open for private viewings today. I know, he looked back at the painting. I've been watching this space for 2 months. Your acquisition strategy is unusual. You're buying work from artists before their market peaks, not after. He tilted his head slightly. That requires either very good instinct or very good data. Which is it? Evelyn blinked. Both. A pause. He turned to face her fully. Jihoon Park, he said. She knew the name. Everyone in her world knew the name, the way they knew the names of weather systems and tectonic plates. Things that shaped terrain without needing to explain themselves. She kept her face neutral. Evelyn Carter, this is my gallery. I know that too. He moved toward the center of the room, hands loose at his sides, still taking inventory. Your lease expires in 8 months. You have 2 outstanding lines of credit, one of which is in default. Your revenue over the last year has dropped 30%. He glanced at her. I'm not saying this to embarrass you. I'm saying it because I prefer to begin conversations from accurate ground. She felt a cold, clean anger move through her. You've been researching my business. I research everything I'm considering investing in. The anger didn't leave, but something shifted beneath it. And what exactly are you considering? He studied her for a long moment, the kind of pause that wasn't uncertainty, but calibration. That, he said, depends on what you're willing to negotiate. He came back the next day. And the day after that. He never announced himself. He would simply appear, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for an hour, and he would ask questions. Not small talk, not pleasantries. Questions with weight. What her 5-year acquisition thesis was, how she thought about risk in illiquid asset classes, whether she believed cultural investment could function as a hedge against market volatility. And Evelyn, who had spent 2 years dating a man who changed the subject when she talked about work, found herself answering in full, because the questions were good, and because he listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone taking real notes. On the 4th visit, she asked him directly, "What do you actually want from me?" He sat down on the gallery bench, the only concession to informality she'd ever seen him make, and looked at her with that calibrating expression. "I need a wife," he said. She waited for more. He didn't offer it. "I'm going to need you to expand on that," she said. "Park Dominion's shareholder vote is in 9 weeks. My board has been under pressure from the Kang Consortium, a rival conglomerate, to pursue a merger alliance through marriage. If I marry their preferred candidate, I cede significant voting control in the restructure." He paused. "If I marry independently, on my own terms before the vote, I retain majority." "And you need a wife immediately." "Before the vote, yes." She stared at him. "Mr. Park." "Jihoon." She stopped. "This is insane." "It is unconventional," he agreed. "But it is also a structured arrangement, not a romantic one. 1 year. After the shareholder vote stabilizes and the board adjusts, we can pursue a quiet separation." He met her eyes. "In exchange, I will resolve your outstanding debt, business and personal, and provide capital investment to stabilize Trove." The room was very quiet. Evelyn thought about her father, about the rehabilitation center in Queens and the bills that arrived with the cheerful formatting of dental office invoices while describing catastrophic sums. She thought about Trove and the 2 employees she still had who hadn't asked for a raise in 8 months because they were loyal and kind and she didn't deserve them. She thought about Daniel Brooks, saying, "You'll never find anyone better than me," on a cold Wednesday night. "I want more than debt resolution," she said. Jihoon's expression didn't change, but something in it sharpened. "Go on." "Co-chair of the Cultural Investment Division. Real authority, not a title on a door. I sit in the meetings. I vote on cultural acquisitions. I have decision-making power on any portfolio under that umbrella." She held his gaze. "My company keeps its identity and its name. I receive a profit share from any cultural division gains." A long silence. "You negotiated that very quickly," he said. "I've been thinking about what I need for a while now." She paused. "I just didn't know what shape it would come in." He was quiet for another moment. The city moved behind him through the gallery windows. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a folder on the bench beside him. "I already acquired 40% of your outstanding business debt," he said, "before this conversation." She felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. "You what?" "I wanted to understand your leverage position before making an offer." He watched her. "You're not as cornered as the numbers suggest. You negotiated yourself a viable lease extension. You protected your best 2 employees. You maintained your collector relationships through a difficult year." He looked at her steadily. "You're not someone who collapses under pressure. I needed to confirm that." She looked at the folder, then at him. "You already bought my debt," she said slowly. "Yes." "Without asking me." "I was researching an acquisition." "Of my business." "Of the liability," he corrected. "There's a difference." She should have been furious. She was furious, and simultaneously, somewhere beneath that, something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. This was how she thought. This was how she moved. Quietly from accurate ground, 3 steps before the conversation began. She had never met anyone who operated the same way. She picked up the folder and opened it. The numbers were exactly as he'd said. He had bought the debt without fanfare, without notification, without leveraging it, yet. He had simply waited. "Fine," she said. "We have a deal." The civil ceremony took 12 minutes. 2 witnesses, Director Choi, Ji-hoon's chief legal officer, a spare, precise woman in her 50s, who seemed to regard Evelyn with the careful neutrality of someone reserving judgment, and a notary public who asked them both 3 times if they were certain. They were. There was no kiss. There was a handshake, which both of them seemed to find more appropriate, and then they were driven in separate cars to the Park Dominion penthouse on the Upper East Side, where Evelyn's belongings had already been moved by a team she'd never met. The penthouse was extraordinary and sterile, and felt, Evelyn thought, exactly like living inside a very beautiful brief. The headlines broke within hours. "Billionaire, Ji-hoon Park, marries unknown art consultant in private ceremony." Her phone did not stop for 2 days. Old clients, curious acquaintances, her father from his rehabilitation center, calling with a voice made strange by medication and emotion. "Evelyn, what did you do?" "Something," she told him honestly. "I'm not sure yet what it is." And then she saw the alert on her phone, a notification from a gossip column, with a photo taken outside the courthouse. Beneath it, someone had tagged Daniel Brooks in the comments. She put the phone face down on the marble countertop. She did not check to see his response. But she thought about it, once, briefly, and then she didn't think about it again. The Park Dominion board met 3 weeks after the wedding. Evelyn prepared for 2 days. She pulled every available document on the cultural acquisition portfolio, a $30 million arm of the conglomerate that had been largely decorative, used for tax strategy and soft diplomacy rather than actual return generation. She ran her own valuation analysis. She built 3 scenarios for market expansion. She drew a direct line between cultural acquisition and infrastructure brand equity in emerging markets, using data from 4 comparable private equity portfolios. She arrived at the boardroom at Park Dominion headquarters wearing a charcoal suit she'd owned for 3 years and recently had taken in, because her body had changed shape under the stress of the last year, and she had needed it to fit again. It fit. She sat at the table. She did not speak first. Director Choi was there. Park Hyun-woo, Ji-hoon's younger brother, 29, warm in a way that seemed slightly at odds with the architecture of the room, sat 2 seats down and gave her a small nod. The rest of the board was older, mostly male. With the settled confidence of men who had been correct in this room for a long time and did not anticipate that changing. The meeting opened with a standard financial review. Then a senior board member named Woo Sang-chul, late 60s, who had watched her sit down with the expression of someone waiting for a mistake, raised the cultural division portfolio. "The cultural arm has generated consistent losses for 3 years," he said. We're recommending it be absorbed into the communications budget and treated as a PR expense. Evelyn looked at the page in front of her. That would be a mistake. The room paused. She did not look at Jihoon, who was at the head of the table. The portfolio has underperformed because it's been managed as a legacy asset, not an active one, she said. You've been acquiring name brand work at peak market value and holding without strategy. That's not investment. That's decoration. She opened her folder and slid copies down the table. She had prepared exactly enough for everyone present. I've identified 6 acquisition targets in 3 emerging markets that would reposition the cultural arm as a genuine return-generating division within 18 months. Sangchul looked at the page without picking it up. Mrs. Park. The infrastructure projects in Vietnam and Indonesia that Park Dominion is currently bidding on require government relationships that don't respond to traditional lobbying, she continued. Cultural capital is a different currency. It opens rooms that money alone cannot. She paused. I've seen this work. I've built this mechanism for private clients on a fraction of the capital this company has available. Silence. Sangchul picked up the page. Around the table, quietly, others did the same. Jihoon had not moved. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. She catalogued it briefly and filed it away. The numbers in Section 3 are projections, Sangchul said, not guaranteed. No, she agreed. Strategy rarely comes with guarantees, but the current approach has delivered 3 consecutive loss years. The projection I'm offering has historical comparable data from 4 analogous portfolios. She looked at him steadily. I'd argue the current strategy is the riskier one. Wu Sangchul looked at Jihoon. Jihoon looked at his wife. Continue with the presentation, he said. She did. And when the meeting ended, 2 hours later, the board had approved the first phase of her expansion proposal. Not unanimously, but with a majority that surprised everyone in the room, including her. Director Choi fell into step beside her in the corridor. You knew you'd get at least 6 votes, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. I knew I had the data, Evelyn said. The rest is about whether people trust data more than they distrust change. She paused. 6 was the number I needed. Choi studied her for a moment. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? A brief silence. Less, Choi said, and walked away. In the penthouse that night, Jihoon was reviewing documents at the kitchen table when Evelyn came home from a follow-up meeting with a gallery director. She dropped her bag, poured herself a glass of water, stood at the counter. The board vote, he said without looking up. What about it? You prepared the secondary data set independently, without access to the internal archive. She turned. I used public comps and my own client history. Your internal archive would have been useful. I asked Choi for access and she declined. She was testing you. I know, she paused. I passed. Now he looked up. That expression again, the one she had catalogued and not yet labeled. You're going to be difficult, he said. She held his gaze. You studied me before you made an offer. You knew exactly what you were acquiring. A long pause. Yes, he said, I did. He went back to his documents. She finished her water. The penthouse held them both in its precise and beautiful silence. Neither of them said anything else. Neither of them needed to. But something had shifted, as quietly and irrevocably as a document signed in a room full of people who had underestimated the woman holding the pen. Park Hyunwoo found her on the penthouse terrace 3 days later. She was reviewing acquisition briefs in the cold air because the inside of the penthouse had started to feel, on certain evenings, like a beautifully designed trap. All right angles and curated silence, and the faint sense that the space had been designed for a version of life she didn't yet know how to inhabit. Hyunwoo came out with 2 mugs of coffee and set one beside her without asking. She accepted it. You were good in the board meeting, he said. He was leaning against the railing, looking at the city. He had his brother's composure but wore it differently, like a coat he'd chosen rather than been born into. Sangchul doesn't concede anything to anyone. You had him reading your materials within 10 minutes. He's not ideological. He's empirical. He just needed the data organized in a way that let him reach his own conclusion. Most people would have tried to argue him into agreement. Most people lose arguments with men like that. She wrapped her hands around the mug. You have to give them a path that feels like their own idea. Hyunwoo was quiet for a moment. He looked at her sideways. My brother is the same way. She didn't respond to that. This family doesn't marry for love, Hyunwoo said. He said it without judgment or sentimentality, the way someone states whether. My parents, my grandfather, the Park marriages have always been structural, strategic. He paused. I want you to know that I'm not saying that as a warning. I'm saying it so you understand what you walked into, because I don't think my brother told you all of it. She looked at him. What didn't he tell me? That the last woman he was supposed to marry before you backed out 3 days before the arrangement was formalized. Board found out. The optics were terrible. He lost credibility with 2 major institutional investors. A pause. He doesn't trust easily. He trusted that arrangement and it cost him. Hyunwoo looked at the city. What you did in that boardroom didn't just impress him. It surprised him. My brother is not easily surprised. Evelyn thought about Jihoon's face at the end of the board meeting. That expression she'd catalogued and not yet labeled. She thought she was beginning to understand what it was. Thank you for telling me, she said. Hyunwoo nodded. He picked up his mug. He was almost back through the terrace door when he paused. For what it's worth, he said, not turning around. I think he made a better choice than he knew he was making. The door closed softly behind him. Evelyn looked at the city, spread out below her like a circuit board. Every light a small life, every intersection a negotiation between momentum and caution. And she thought about choices. About the ones that get made in desperation, and the ones that get made in clarity, and how sometimes the most important ones are made in a moment so thin and unremarkable that you don't recognize their weight until you're standing on the other side of them, looking back. She had signed that document at a gallery bench, surrounded by half-hung paintings, because she needed to survive. She had not expected to arrive here. She was not certain yet what here was. But she picked up her briefing documents in the cold air and went back inside. And when she passed the kitchen table where Jihoon was still working, always working, the man existed in a state of perpetual productive solitude. She paused. Hyunwoo told me about the previous arrangement, she said. He didn't look up immediately. She had noticed he did that processed before responding, never from anxiety, always from precision. Then he set down his pen. It doesn't affect the current agreement, he said. I know, I'm not raising it to renegotiate. She held the files against her chest. I'm raising it because if I'm going to do this right, the cultural division, the board, all of it, I need to understand the full terrain. She met his eyes. I work better with complete information. A long pause. Yes, he said finally. So do I. She nodded, moved toward the hallway. Evelyn. She stopped. The previous arrangement failed because she wanted something decorative, he said. She wanted the title and the life and the access, but not the accountability. He looked at her steadily. You came in and asked for accountability. I asked for authority, she corrected. In this context, he said, they are the same thing. She thought about that for a long time after she turned the light out. Authority and accountability. 2 sides of the same door. Most people wanted to walk through and leave the door behind them. She had always understood, even before she'd had the language for it, that the door was the point. That you carried it with you. That leadership was not a destination, but a posture you held even when no one was watching, even when the room was empty, even when the only person who needed to believe in your capacity was yourself. Daniel had not understood that. He had seen her instability as proof of her inadequacy, rather than as a season she was passing through. She thought about what Jihoon had said. She wanted the title and the life and the access, but not the accountability. And she thought quietly, in the dark of the penthouse bedroom, that the saddest part of what Daniel had said to her on that Wednesday night was not that it was cruel. It was that for a while, for weeks, in the small hours with her face in her hands, she had believed it might be true. If you're still watching, and if you are, I need you to know that what happens next changes everything. Hit that like button right now, because this story is about to turn in ways nobody in that boardroom saw coming. And subscribe if you haven't yet. You don't want to miss it. The call came on a Thursday morning. Evelyn was in the middle of reviewing a contract for a Nairobi-based artist whose work she'd been tracking for 14 months. A painter named Adiz Okonkwo, who was doing things with texture and reclaimed industrial material that the market hadn't caught up to yet, but would, and soon. When her assistant knocked and told her that a company called Meridian Capital Partners had requested a partnership, meeting with Park Dominion's Cultural Investment Division. She didn't recognize the name immediately. She looked it up. Meridian Capital Partners, established 14 months ago, seed stage funding vehicle, focus on consumer tech and SaaS platforms. Net assets, modest but with 2 promising portfolio companies and a recently secured anchor investor whose name made Evelyn set her pen down and stare at her screen for a moment. The anchor investor was Vivian Chen's family fund. And the founder and managing partner of Meridian Capital Partners was Daniel Brooks. She sat with that for a moment. The city moved past her window. Somewhere below, the ordinary machinery of other people's lives turned without her in it. Then she picked up her pen. "Schedule the meeting," she told her assistant. "Standard terms, next Tuesday." She did not tell Jihoon. Not yet. She wanted to see the shape of the thing first, to understand what Daniel was building, what he wanted from Park Dominion, and whether he knew who would be sitting across the table. She suspected he didn't. She let herself have the quiet satisfaction of that for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went back to Adiz Okonkwo's contract. Tuesday came in cold and clear. Evelyn arrived at the Park Dominion executive floor at 8:15. She reviewed Meridian's deck, which she had received the previous evening, and spent 2 hours disassembling the way you disassemble a watch, not to break it, but to understand which parts were doing actual work and which were decorative. The projections in Section 4 were optimistic in a way that required 3 assumptions to simultaneously hold true. The market sizing in Section 2 borrowed from 2 studies that were 18 months old in a space that moved faster than that. The team's slide was strong. The product roadmap was coherent but thin. It was a deck built to impress a room that wasn't paying close attention. At 9:50, she settled into the chair at the head of the conference table. Director Choi sat to her right. 2 senior analysts flanked the table's midpoint. Hyunwoo had stopped by in the morning, seen the meeting name on the schedule board, looked at Evelyn, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of comment. At 10 o'clock, the door opened. Daniel Brooks walked in. He was wearing a better suit than the last time she'd seen him. The anchor investor's money, probably. He had the polished momentum of someone who had recently been told, by enough people with enough money, that he was worth believing in. He carried his pitch deck in a slim leather portfolio. He was already smiling, that particular smile that arrives before the room does, that assumes welcome. He saw the conference table. He saw Director Choi. He saw the analysts. And then he saw Evelyn. The smile didn't disappear, but it changed, a microscopic recalibration, a barely perceptible dimming, like a light that registers a fluctuation in current. His stride didn't break. He kept walking. He was good at surfaces. But she saw it. She had always been good at seeing the thing underneath. "Mrs. Park," Director Choi said, making the introduction smooth and deliberate. "This is Daniel Brooks, founder of Meridian Capital Partners. Mr. Brooks, this is Evelyn Park, co-chair of our Cultural Investment Division." Daniel took the seat across from her. For a moment, just a moment, they looked at each other across the polished table. 2 people in a room that had entirely rearranged itself around one of them since the last time they'd been in the same space. "Daniel," Evelyn said. Her voice was warm even, the way a room is warm before you notice there's no exit. "It's good to see you. Please go ahead." He opened the portfolio. He began. He was good. She would give him that. He had a natural fluency in front of a room, the timing of a man who had spent years believing that presence was the same as substance. He moved through the deck with confidence, hitting the highlights, reading the table's energy, adjusting emphasis when he sensed attention shifting. He was performing for Choi and the analysts. He had assessed, correctly, that they were the gatekeepers. What he had not yet understood was that the gate was hers. She let him finish. "Thank you," she said. "I have a few questions." He turned to her, fully now no more peripheral management. "Of course." "The market sizing in Section 2. She opened her copy of the deck. "You're citing the Forrester 2023 report and the Gartner vertical analysis from Q3 of the same year. Both of those predate the regulatory shift in the EU that's restructured the SaaS compliance cost structure. Have you modeled the impact on your two primary portfolio companies' margins?" A pause, small but real. "The regulatory environment is something we're monitoring closely." "I'm asking whether you've modeled it," she kept her voice pleasant. "Specifically, our projections account for a range of regulatory scenarios." "The deck shows one scenario," she said. "The favorable one." She flipped to page 12. "The sensitivity analysis you've included assumes a 12% operating margin floor. That floor doesn't hold if the compliance cost increase exceeds 8%, which the EU implementation timeline suggests is likely in the next 24 months. She looked at him. "Have you modeled the downside?" The room was quiet. Daniel's jaw was doing the thing. That microscopic tension that she had learned to recognize years ago as the signal that he was recalibrating, buying time, looking for the foothold. "Evelyn." "Mrs. Park," Choi said quietly from her right, not sharply, just a correction, like a note played in tune. Something moved across Daniel's face. A flash of something old and specific, the particular irritation of a man who has been corrected in a room where he expected to be deferred to. "Mrs. Park," he said, "I understand there are modeling gaps we can address in a follow-up." "The issue isn't the modeling gaps," she said. "I can work with modeling gaps. Projections are projections. The issue is that the deck presents a single scenario as comprehensive analysis. That tells me something about the decision-making culture at Meridian." She closed the deck. "Which is actually my primary concern." Silence. One of the analysts had stopped writing. "The product roadmap is good," she continued, and her voice was not unkind, it was precise, which was different. "The team slide is your strongest section. If those two things are representative of what Meridian actually is, then this is a fundable thesis at the right terms." She set her pen down. "But I need to see the complete model. I need the downside scenarios. And I need to understand why they weren't included in the initial deck, presented to a partner whose primary responsibility is risk-calibrated capital allocation." A long pause. Daniel looked at her across the table. For a moment, and she saw it, she couldn't not see it. She knew his face too well. Something moved behind his eyes that wasn't professional. It was older than that. It was the face of a man confronting a version of reality he had told himself wasn't possible. He had told her she would never find anyone better. He had not imagined that she might become something larger than that sentence. "I'll have the complete model to you by end of week," he said. His voice was steady. She credited him for that. "Good," she looked at Choi. "Director Choi will coordinate the follow-up." She stood. The room stood. "Thank you for coming in," she said, and her voice was genuinely even, genuinely professional, because this was not personal. Or rather, it had started as personal years ago on a cold Wednesday night, and had traveled so far from that origin point that it was now simply the truth of who she was and who she had become. "The opportunity has merit. We'll review the complete package." She walked out of the conference room. In the corridor, she stopped at the window that looked out over the city. She pressed 2 fingers against the glass, cool, solid, real, and breathed. Then she heard footsteps she recognized. Ji-hoon fell into step beside her without preamble. "You knew he was coming," she said, not an accusation. "Choi flagged it Monday morning." A pause. "I wanted to see how you'd handle it." She turned to look at him. You could have told me. You had already scheduled the meeting. He met her eyes. You didn't need my intervention. She held his gaze for a moment. That's not the same as not wanting to know. He considered that. Something shifted in his expression, not much, but she was getting better at reading the small movements in that particular landscape. You're right, he said. I should have told you. A pause. I apologize. She blinked. She had not expected that. In 3 months of sharing a penthouse with Ji-hoon Park, she had not once heard him apologize to anyone. She filed it carefully, like an acquisition that needed more time before she understood its value. He'll send the revised model, she said, turning back to the window. It'll be better than the first deck. He's not incompetent. No, Ji-hoon agreed. He is. But the cultural division doesn't need what he's building. The strategic fit isn't there. She straightened. I'll recommend against the partnership. The terms would be unfavorable and the alignment is off. And the fact that he's your former partner doesn't factor into the analysis. I know, Ji-hoon said. And the way he said it, without decoration, without qualification, simply as a statement of what he knew to be true, was one of the more disorienting things he had ever said to her. Because she realized, standing at that window, that she believed him. The Kang Consortium moved on a Friday. It began quietly, the way the most dangerous things do. A financial journalist published a piece in a Seoul-based business outlet suggesting that Park Dominion's recent strategic shifts, including the cultural investment expansion and the unorthodox marriage, reflected internal instability at the chairman level. The piece was thin on sourcing and heavy on implication. By itself, it meant little. But then on Monday, Park Dominion's share price dropped 2 points on light volume. And on Tuesday, a rumor circulated through 3 separate financial channels simultaneously that the company was facing a whistleblower complaint related to a prior infrastructure bid in Southeast Asia. The complaint did not exist. Evelyn found that out in 40 minutes through channels that didn't require Ji-hoon's legal team. She called Director Choi from her own office and delivered the information with a sourcing chain attached. Choi was quiet for a moment on the phone. How did you get this? My collector network includes 3 journalists in Seoul, 2 compliance attorneys with regional expertise, and a former government minister who owes me a significant favor from a 2021 cultural acquisition that I structured very quietly on his behalf. A pause. I told you this division was underutilized. Another silence. The Kang Consortium, Choi said. Has to be. The timing maps to the shareholder vote. They didn't get the alliance marriage. They're trying to destabilize the board's confidence in Ji-hoon before the vote window closes. She pulled up a document on her screen. The share price drop was engineered. The volume pattern is consistent with coordinated sell pressure from 2 or 3 institutional holders, not organic movement. Someone with relationships in those institutions made calls. This is a significant allegation, without complete evidence. I have 60% of the evidence, Evelyn said. I need access to the internal trading records and the comms log from the board secretary's office for the last 2 weeks. A very long pause. I'll bring this to the chairman, Choi said. I'd prefer to bring it to the chairman myself. She did. Ji-hoon's office was on the 41st floor, not the top, which she had once thought was unusual for a man with his resources, until she understood that he had no interest in symbolism for its own sake. He worked toward the inside of the building, away from the view, because he found the view distracting. She liked that about him, she had recently realized, the absence of performance. She laid everything out on his desk. He read it in silence, the entire sourcing chain, the volume analysis, the timeline mapping. She stood across from him and waited. You built this today, he said. This morning. He looked up. Why didn't you bring this to Choi first? I did. She said she'd bring it to you. I said I'd prefer to do it myself. She held his gaze. Because I want to propose the counter strategy directly, and I didn't want it filtered. He set the documents down. Go ahead. She had thought about this for 3 hours. She had stress-tested the logic from 6 different angles, looking for the place where it broke. It didn't break. The Kang Consortium's weakest holding is a mid-sized logistics subsidiary, Kang Meridian Freight, which has nothing to do with Daniel's company, different name entirely, operating in 3 Southeast Asian markets that overlap with Park Dominion's infrastructure corridors. She pulled out a single page and placed it in front of him. The subsidiary has been underperforming for 2 years. The Kang family has been trying to divest it quietly without triggering a valuation conversation with their board. The right acquisition offer, structured correctly, would be accepted. He looked at the page. You want to acquire their subsidiary. Quietly, before the shareholder vote, not as retaliation as strategy. She leaned forward slightly. If Park Dominion owns that logistics corridor, 3 things happen. The infrastructure bid in Vietnam becomes significantly more competitive. The cultural division gains access to a regional distribution network for art and heritage installations that's worth 10 times the acquisition price. And the Kang Consortium loses its most actionable position in the markets where you're currently competing. Ji-hoon was looking at the page. She waited. You don't win wars defensively, she said. He looked up. That expression again, the one she now knew the name of. It wasn't just respect. It was the particular regard of someone encountering a mind that moves the way their own does, from the same instincts toward the same horizon. The acquisition will require board approval, he said. I'll have the motion ready by Thursday. The Kang family will recognize the move. After it's done, she said. Not before. The structure I'm proposing keeps the buyer identity in a holding entity for 60 days post-close. Standard practice. Completely defensible. A pause. Who taught you to think like this? He asked. She considered that. Necessity, she said. Mostly. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in the room that wasn't words. A current of something that had been building for weeks in boardrooms and corridors, and a penthouse that was slowly beginning to feel less like a brief and more like a home. Lead the acquisition, he said. She picked up the page. I intend to. The acquisition closed in 11 days. It was one of the fastest closings Park Dominion's legal team had executed in 4 years, which Director Choi mentioned with a composure that was as close to admiration as Evelyn suspected the woman came in professional settings. The Kang Consortium did not see it until the filing hit the public record. By then, the shareholder vote was 8 days away, and the ground had shifted entirely. The coordinated share pressure stopped. The media rumors went quiet. The supposed whistleblower complaint was never mentioned again. In the financial press, a single paragraph appeared in a Korean business daily noting that Park Dominion had made a strategic logistics acquisition that strengthened its Southeast Asian infrastructure position ahead of a major vote. The piece speculated briefly about the strategic timing. It did not mention Evelyn by name. 3 board members called Ji-hoon directly to say the acquisition had been well executed. He forwarded each call note to her with a single line. They're talking about your work. She read each one in her office with the door closed. She did not let herself feel it fully until the 3rd one, and then she did, just for a moment, alone, with the city below her and the acquisition documents stacked on the corner of her desk. She let herself feel the weight of what she had built from a negotiation at a gallery bench and a desperate signature, and a year of keeping her spine straight when everything in her life was trying to pull it crooked. She thought about her father. She called him that evening, from the penthouse terrace. The bills are cleared, she told him. All of them. You don't need to worry about the facility. Raymond Carter was quiet for a moment. She could hear the sounds of the rehabilitation center in the background, the gentle institutional hum of a place that kept people alive while they found their way back to themselves. Evelyn, he said. His voice was thicker than it used to be, the stroke having left a slight heaviness in certain syllables, but the warmth was the same. It had always been the same. Tell me you're all right. I'm all right, she said. Are you happy? She looked at the city, thought about the boardroom that morning and the acquisition filing and the forwarded call notes, and the way Ji-hoon had said lead the acquisition without hesitation, without condition. "I think," she said carefully, "I'm becoming something, I'm not sure yet what it is, but it feels like mine." Her father was quiet. "That's better than happy," he said finally. "Happy comes and goes, becoming something that's permanent." She stayed on the terrace, a long time after they hung up. That night, the penthouse was quiet in a different way than usual. Ji-hoon was on the terrace when she came out. He was standing with a glass of water. He rarely drank. She had learned, looking at the city below. He didn't turn when she appeared but shifted slightly, a small unconscious accommodation of her presence in the space. She stood beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. "I came to you for survival," she said. Not an accusation, not a revelation, just the truth said out loud in the night air because she was tired of carrying it around unremarked. "When I agreed to your proposal, I came because I needed to survive." He was quiet. "I know," he said. "You married me to keep control of the vote." "Yes." The city hummed below them. Somewhere a siren moved through the grid and faded. "And now," she asked, not romantically, not as a pressure. As a genuine question, the way she asked all genuine questions, openly, without guile, because she had learned that clarity was always more useful than comfort. He turned to look at her, not the calibrating look, something less guarded than that. "Somewhere between the board meetings and the acquisition," he said, "I stopped thinking of this as a controlled arrangement." He paused. "I'm not certain when that happened." She held his gaze. "You didn't find someone better," he said. The way he meant it, you didn't find a better version of what he thought you needed. He looked at her steadily. "You became someone stronger than the person he was insulting." That hit somewhere deep and specific, in the place where that sentence had lodged months ago on a cold Wednesday night. She felt it shift, not disappear, but change shape. The way scar tissue changes shape remains, but no longer controls the range of motion. "That's not a declaration," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's an observation." "Of someone you respect." "Yes." She looked at the city for a long moment. "That's enough," she said, and meant it completely, without resignation, without the small grief that attaches to settling. She meant it the way you mean something you've built yourself, that holds weight because you understand every joint and seam. It was enough, it was real, it was hers. The shareholder vote passed, with 67% majority. Park Dominion's stock recovered, and then climbed. The Southeast Asian infrastructure bid came in competitive. The Cultural Investment Division closed its first acquisition under Evelyn's strategy, a collection of works from 4 emerging artists across 3 continents, structured with a 10-year hold period and an estimated return curve that made 2 of the previously skeptical board members request a personal briefing. Sanchel requested the briefing himself. She gave it without ceremony. He shook her hand at the end and said, "I was wrong about you." She said, "You were working with incomplete information. Now you have more." She paused. "I hope we keep working together." He almost smiled, not quite, but close. Daniel's revised deck arrived on Friday, as promised. The modeling was better. He had clearly spent real time on the downside scenarios, but the strategic fit still wasn't there. She sent a brief, professional decline, noted the specific improvements in the analysis, and suggested they revisit in 12 months if Meridian's regulatory positioning had been addressed. She did not add anything personal. There was nothing personal left to add. She pressed send and closed the window and moved on. 6 months after a civil ceremony that had taken 12 minutes and changed the entire geography of her life, Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Park, stood at the head of a boardroom on the 42nd floor and signed the final document in the Meridian Capital Review. A denial. Clean, final, professional. She slid it across the table. Meeting adjourned. And afterward in the elevator, with the mirrored doors sliding shut and the city rising around them, Ji-hoon stood beside her, not in front, not behind, and said, "Careful, Mrs. Park, you enjoy firing people too much." She looked at her own reflection. The composure, the ease, the woman who had sat on cold steps with her face in her hands and believed, for a terrible season, that she was worth less than a sentence someone had thrown away. She smiled. "You married me." The elevator descended. Outside, press cameras were already gathering for a quarterly earnings announcement. A reporter would ask her, within the hour, whether she regretted marrying into power. She already knew the answer. Power didn't change me, it revealed me. But later, much later, in the quiet of the terrace with the city spread out below, and Jihoon's shoulder close to hers in the dark, she would think about that question differently. She would think about what it meant to be revealed. Whether the self that gets revealed by power was always there, waiting, or whether it gets built, day by day, choice by choice, contract by signed contract in rooms full of people who were watching to see if you'd flinch. She didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure there was one. But here is the question she left with, the one that stayed, long after the cameras faded, and the deal closed, and the board voted, and the man who had once told her she would never find better had gathered his rejected proposals and walked out into the city. If someone who loved you once told you that you were not enough, and you went out and built a life that proved them wrong, was it their cruelty that made you, or were you always this? And which answer is easier to live with? If this story moved something in you, I need you to tell me in the comments, because the best stories only come alive when someone receives them. Like this video if Evelyn earned it. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And think about that last question. Take your time.